to use a prophet.
Yeah. I said to everyone that was Truth Matters was going to fill quick. Like right at noon, get in there.
Well, you weren't kidding.
Quite that quick, yeah. All right. Well, let's begin. We're looking at the same passage we looked at last week. 1 Peter chapter 2, 11 to 17. And we're going to take a look at the same passage. Last week we wanted to do is give the overview, and now we're going to dig into the prickly issue. Typically, it wouldn't have been as prickly an issue like a year and a half ago. But let's read the passage. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether to a king or as to one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise to those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Okay, so just reviewing from last week, that's why I left this up, this is the structure of these verses. Okay, and I said this last week, but I'll say it again, that what you have here is a way in Eastern argumentation where your main point is in the center, and you build up to it, and then you come down from it, and you have these bookends, and that's what you have here. So you have holiness, testimony, submission, and like I said, if I could have put submission if I broke up the verses into two verses and put submission, but the central point is the submission to government.
Switch it.
Yeah, I know. I also had a whole week to not only switch it, but if I did that, I could have not had it run into the edge. But hey, but what we end up seeing though is he's focusing in on, hey, our personal holiness leads to our personal testimony. Our personal testimony leads to our submission to the government. That's basically the overarching thing. And when we look at this issue, submission to government, we've heard a lot of that since March of 2020, right? I don't think there's been as much discussion on submission to government prior to March 2020 as there has been after within Christianity. It's a thing. Now let's put it in the context though, right? In Peter's day, Peter was dealing with some of the same issues we were dealing with, with a tyrannical government that's coming down in force upon Christians. That was going on in Peter's day. We're seeing the beginnings of that in our day, just as Peter was seeing the beginnings of it in his day. So there is some, things we can see here as parallel in the cultural venue that Peter's trying to address with his audience. So I say that to say we can't just say, oh, well, that was Peter. That was first century. He doesn't know what it's like living under COVID. No, they had their different rules, but it was still the same type of government trying to enforce things. And some of the things they were starting to do was put pressure on Christians. And so as we look at this, I think that we have a lot of people who've been looking at this issue from a position from Romans 13, which we could, why don't we just turn there briefly? Because this is a passage that everyone's quoting nowadays. And this is a passage which goes into a little bit more explanation on this. But Romans 13, starting in verse 1, and this is kind of this whole chapter really covers it, but Romans 13:1, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not the cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. He goes, well, I'll just keep reading. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to the very thing. Render to all what is due them, taxes to whom taxes are due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear is due, honor to whom honor. Owe nothing to anyone except love, to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this you shall not commit adultery, you shall not commit murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong. To a neighbor, therefore, love is to fulfill the law. Do this knowing the time that is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now, salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. The night is almost gone, and the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly in the day, and not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regards to its lusts. Now you see this whole thing is summarized by Peter. Okay, now you are seeing some differences here. Romans, I think it was written a little bit before Peter. For Paul, he's saying, hey, like if you do good, you have nothing to fear. And that's an argument many make. And we look at this and go, yeah, but there are governments that persecute Christians. I mean, they do good, and yet they do have something to fear. And that is exactly the context that Peter would be arguing, because what's he arguing? Peter's arguing the fact that here you are having people who are persecuted. It makes that clear in chapter 1, verse 1. Okay. And so, this is one of the passages I couldn't get to on Sunday. There's a lot here that sound familiar to Sunday's message. Okay. On loving thy neighbor. But I think I went too long as is. I didn't finish the passage as is. So, but you're seeing here that what we have in Peter summarizes all of Romans 13. Okay, so Romans 13 is more detailed. So the questions that come up when they read Romans 13, and a lot of people have been asking, what do you do when the government tells you, that you should do something against what Scripture says? Well, then you don't obey the government, but you submit to whatever consequences. Let me give you a good example that from this week, right? So when this thing started, many churches closed down, just not knowing what the situation. You were kind of a different situation. The building closed down, so we didn't have one. But churches like Grace Community Church closed down. And once they tried to gather together, following all the guidelines that were being put out by the state. I was in communications with some folks, and like every Monday they would they tried different things, like they put a tent outside, and they were trying to keep people limited between people in the sanctuary, people in the tent, and people in the family center. So if they had less people, they spread them all out in 3 sections. So you had a third of the people in each of those, and they were going to try to add more. They already have 2 services. They're going to try to add more services. Well, what ended up happening is that they would do these things on Monday and make an announcement, and then by like Thursday, Friday, the city or state would shut it down. Okay, so it got to the point where the city basically had policies for protesting outside, and for protesting, social distancing wasn't necessary, masks weren't necessary, and so Grace Community Church tried to do that, and that was shut down. So it became clear that they were targeting the church, and that's when they took a stand. Now, what did they do? They took the stand of saying, we're going to open, that's it, we're done, and whatever penalties is what we're going to pay. And so part of the penalty was a $1,000 fine. I think it was a week, but I think MacArthur said it was a day. So I don't know if it was every day they were open, just counting the Sundays. I kind of think that's what, because I know that they were having to put in escrow $1,000 every week for the fines. Okay, so what did they do? They accepted whatever consequence was going to come, but they challenged it. We happen to live in a country where they could challenge it, so they challenged that. What got announced recently is not only did they pay over $1 million in legal fees, but they had to actually pay Grace Community Church's legal fees. Now, that's not heard of typically. You have that if you're in a breach of contract, things like that, in the cases where basically somebody forced somebody to go to court, to protect their own rights. That's basically what happened here. So now that's a case where there's a lot of discussion. Did Grace Community Church do what was right, do what was wrong? Okay. Well, the reality is now the injunction that they have on the state and the city of Los Angeles is they cannot target any houses of worship like that again. So not only is Grace Community Church protected, but even those pastors in California that criticize Grace Community Church are now protected, right? So why? Because we are commanded. It's kind of the definition of church. Church is a gathering. You can't do church without gathering. It's kind of in the name, ecclesia. That's what it means. It's a gathering together. So you can't do church at home, So what you end up seeing there is they fought that using the legal means, but accepting the consequences that could come. All right. And that becomes something that we see when we see people that say, well, we should just fight the government. Okay. That's not what Paul is saying. That's not what Peter is saying. Is there times to fight the government? Well, Grace Community Church fought the government, right? But they did it legally. They did it within the legal means that's allotted to us. And what was their argument? Their argument was really that the government was breaking the law, and they were. And that's why they won and had their legal fees paid. $800,000 in legal fees were paid back to Grace Community Church. And the parking lot that they took away from Grace Community Church was given back to them. So they have the lease back again. Now, I don't know if they're allowed to take the lease away. I don't know how that works because it's a lease. They should just be forced to have to give the parking lot to Grace Community Church. That's my theory. But what you end up seeing is that when we talk about these issues, there are people, especially in America, very patriotic. We're used to our individual rights. And there are Americans, and I think this is more, you're going to see this in America than other countries, where our individualism, we feel that we have the right to stand up and fight for our rights. Other countries don't have that so much because they aren't a country of, individualism. It's a country where the government, you're there for the government. Even if if they have certain freedoms, like in Europe, they have certain freedoms, but the government kind of still rules things. They were used to kings. So we didn't have that in our country, And so, we did once and we rebelled against it. And so, the thing that you end up seeing is we see here that when it comes to submission to government, notice both Paul and Peter are saying some of the same things. Though it takes Paul a while to get there, at the end, he also talks about, this issue of our lusts, our flesh, Why? Because what is it that causes a person to challenge the government against God's wishes? Pride. And this is some of what we see going on both sides that we see going on today. We see a lot of pride on both sides. We see pride of people saying, nope, the church should just close until the government says it's okay. And there's ones that are saying, we're not going to close. We don't care what the government says. But they're not, but they're in opposition. So a real difference you could see even up in Canada. 2 pastors that got arrested. There were 3 total that got arrested. James Coates and I forget Tim's last name. Tim Stevens. And the behavior the 2 of them had compared to the Ukrainian guy, I forget his name. I'm actually friends with him on Facebook. Arthur's on. He added me at some point. I never knew that. So, but I just knew it because he recently posted. I'm like, wait, I know that name now. But you look at the contrast between those 2. Very different behavior. Now, some of it, granted, Arthur's background has influenced that, but you look at both of them and go, which one was honoring Christ? Right? James Coates, he knew he was breaking the law, and he went to the police. He didn't, he said, you want me to come in? I'll come in. He submitted to the consequences. He didn't fight the consequences. He just said, the moment you let me out, we're opening up again. And they kind of went underground. I mean, they're like, okay, you locked up our church, you blocked it up. We're just going to go find somewhere else to worship. And their whole church was driving an hour or 2 outside the city to find places to worship. And they'd move it around so that, that takes a lot away from the ministry you want to do. But they were doing that versus, Arthur's, throwing them out and making a big scene and getting onto the talk show circuit. And, there's a difference there, right? It takes away, what he ended up doing was taking away from Christ. Where when you look at the behavior of, Tim and I just drew a blank on his name again. James Coates. So, you look at those 2 and they're just like, Tim being arrested outside his house with his kids watching. And he's like, they're handcuffing him. And he's like, can you please just put me in the car? Like my kids really need to see this, so that there's what you end up seeing there is one is on, you have more honor for Christ in that behavior. Okay. Now there's lots of people on both sides with, feeling like one's right, the other's right. The issue I would have where I would stand is to say this, we honor God first. And I think that's why Peter lays out this argument. If we're concerned with our holiness and our testimony, it's going to affect how we approach our submission to the government. If we're worried about our own pride, if we're focused on our rights, then that's going to change the way that we focus on our submission to authority. In other words, if it's hey, we got these rights, I'm going to be in your face. You may have the right, but you're not honoring God. And this is not something, I'm not taking a new position for myself that, because of COVID. I mean, when I used to have people that would be on the streets and evangelizing, you have the police officers that would come up and, give you a hard time. And I've always, there's some of those guys that's, we're on public property. We have the right for free speech. You can't stop us. And I've always said, the guys that get in the officer's face, you may win in court, but you'll lose that day. The officers got pride too. And when it's, when you're challenging authorities, guess what? The officer sometimes is going to go, well, I'm going to prove to you I have the authority tonight, and you're going to go to jail, and then you'll worry about it in court. And he doesn't show up to court, and he doesn't bother him a bit, right? You just took him off the street for a little while doing paperwork that he didn't want to have to do. So now he's annoyed with you, and he's just going to make sure you're, spending at least the night in jail or something, right? So where the difference is just submitting to the authority and being respectful to the authority has won me favor many times. We had Princeton University one year, and we had we actually called the police department ahead of time, and got and my friend Michael actually got a recording of the chief saying that we can amplify. And it was funny because, we had the recording. Someone calls up, once we're preaching, and they're blasting music out the window, and the officer ends up, they're trying to figure out what to do. They end up giving Michael Stockwell, not the guy who recorded the police officer, that's Michael Markavich, gives Michael Stockwell a ticket for amplification. Michael didn't even know what was happening. This conversation is happening over here. He's just over here preaching, and all of a sudden he's issued a ticket. It was kind of interesting what had happened. Now, a year prior, I was on the same campus, same officer. He actually remembered me. What happened was that, we had someone that was up there, sharing the gospel. Someone comes up and says, what about homosexuality? And so what, my one friend, Robert, did was he just said, oh, well, go talk to my friend over here, redirects him to someone else so he's not having to deal with it in public, and just tells him, has him read from scripture, passages on homosexuality. And all he did was read scripture. And that kid called the cops and accused us of hate crimes. So now the police officer's there, and I was evangelizing one-on-one. I didn't get up and do any open air at that point. And I'm talking one-on-one with this woman who's asking a lot of questions. And so I'm sharing the gospel with her. Now I realize we have a situation because Robert's getting in the face of the officer. And the officer's about to just shut us down. So I kind of said, excuse myself from my conversation I was having. I said, just hang out for a second. Let me just deal with something over here. I walked over to the officer. I said, I'm sorry, I'm kind of running the team here. What's the issue? And the officer starts explaining it. I said, are you stopping us here tonight from doing open air? I believe we're in public property and have the right. Is that correct? Now, what am I doing? I'm asking questions and being respectful. Totally changed the police officer's demeanor. He was just about to shut us down, and his demeanor changed. And I said, okay, would we be allowed to preach? Actually, Mike Stockwell took our preaching box and put it back in the car and came back. And, he's like, no, you can keep going. I said, okay, hey, Mike, go get the preaching box. I figured I'll preach. So I get up there, and sure enough, the same kid stands right in front of me and goes, well, what do you think about homosexuality? I said, I don't care. Just don't try to kiss me. And he's like, what does God think about homosexuality? I go, well, what do you think God thinks about it? He goes, he says it's a sin. I agree. And the kid ran over to the officer going, he's hate speech. He's speaking against homosexuality. I said, officer, arrest him. He's the one that said it was a sin. I just agreed with him. The officer laughed. and he turned as I continued preaching, because the kid realized, okay, that didn't work. He ends up going to Michael Stockwell and goes, hey, I got to go be somewhere. I'm going to be back in an hour. If you guys are here, I'll take that, because he had to take a statement. He's like, I'll be back in an hour to take that statement. Well, we were done preaching anyway. So I get done preaching. Mike tells us that, and we're like, I think he was saying, if we're not here in an hour, there's no problem. Well, a year later, that same officer remembered me when we had the issue now, this time with the amplification, the chief actually came out. And Michael Markavich was like, I have you, like, here, play. Here, this is you telling us we can amplify. And Michael Markavich and I kind of played good cop, bad cop. And so he's getting in the face of the captain. And then I'm like the nice guy. And it was interesting because the officer turned to the captain and said, basically the captain said, chief, whatever, said, go give him a ticket. So the officer went and gave him a ticket, comes back. And we're still trying to negotiate it, not realizing he got a ticket. And I just said to the captain, I said, ma'am, are you really going to give a man who served his country honorably a ticket for something he doesn't even know what's going on? And the other officer said to the chief, goes, you should listen to this man. He's very reasonable. I've dealt with him before. And her whole demeanor changed. And she was like, don't give him the ticket. And he's like, well, I already did. The interesting thing is they actually changed by the time he got to court, they changed it like 3 or 4 times of what he supposedly got a ticket for, but he got off. But the point being is our demeanor carries a lot of how we're going to do things. Why would the officer remember me and say to his commanding officer, talk to this guy, not that guy, right? Because of the way we conduct ourselves. Okay. Now, not saying that we should play good cop, bad cop. Michael has a different agenda. He wants to challenge things in court, the First Amendment, so he does press a little bit more than I would. Okay. Notice we can still be friends, right? But the thing is what I think you do is with this model that Peter gives us, we are to be thinking about our holiness, our testimony as we approach how we're going to view government. So with all of that as a backdrop, let's look at the text. Verse 13 and 14. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. Now, right there, let's just stop there. That's the whole thing. I mean, that's what Paul was trying to argue in Romans 13, right? Who is it that sets up and establishes what Peter will call human institutions, but government? God. So the argument that Paul makes is submitting to government is submitting to God. Same argument he makes, wives submitting to husbands is submitting to who? God. By the way, husbands submitting to wives. Because, verse before that, everyone kind of forgets that within the church, we're all to submit to one another. Oops. Who's that submission unto? God. You see, the focus is not on my rights as much as it is on God. My submission to God. If God established this, do I know why God allowed a lab in Wuhan to create COVID? Oh, yeah, I did just say what really happened, right? Why did God allow the creation of this man-made virus in Wuhan lab to get out and spread this way? I have no idea. But he allowed it to happen. How do I know that? It happened. Right? So what's he trying to do through all this? I don't know. Does he want to bring Marxism to America? Maybe. Would my fighting Marxism actually be fighting God's will? You see, do I want Marxism? No, I think it's wicked and evil. It's against everything God would say is right. The question is, what's God using it for? Think about this. He's saying to submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every institution. There's another time the nation of Israel was told to submit to Babylon as they were coming in to conquer the nation of Israel and take them into 70 years of captivity. And Jeremiah is the prophet that is told to say to them to submit to that. Don't fight it. Wait, we're going into captivity. We're losing all our rights. Well, God is doing something else. Fighting against Babylon would have been fighting God's will. He had something else planned. And so someone online, Chris Honholz, is saying we can fight for our rights without being holy terrors. So yeah, and that's a good way of saying it. A lot of people are fighting for, they want to fight for their rights, and there becomes a pride issue that you end up seeing. And that is the thing that we have to check when it comes to this issue. And I think that's why Peter lays this out, is because I think people had the same pride back then as we have today. I could be wrong. I think all of humanity has had this since Adam and Eve. And so what you end up seeing is they were fighting, Peter knows that they would want to fight against what God was doing back then as well. So we're submitting unto the Lord, not unto the government, unto the Lord. So there becomes a difference. The submission unto the Lord is going to be that we're going to accept whatever the Lord's going to do, whether we like it or not. Okay?
What's your take on, if I could ask, what's your take on Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he was in the committee to kill Hitler?
Yeah. I don't know enough about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's plan to kill Hitler, but I mean,
I know he was involved. I don't know.
Yeah, I know he stood up to the Nazis, and they're standing up like he did, or I'm trying to blank the founder of Voice of the Martyrs. I'm trying to remember his Warmbrandt. Yeah, Robert Warmbrandt. There's like what Robert Warmbrandt did. What did he do? He stood up and basically confronted the communists at a, where the communists called a meeting of religious people to try to win them over, right? Just note that, because that's common, right? There's talk that, that Southern Baptist Convention, which was at least the most conservative denomination, they had an ethics committee that's been funded by Soros, supposedly. Well, if that's true, that's not uncommon, right? Get the more conservative group to sway over, and that's why you see so many in the Southern Baptists who have gone woke, possibly, because there are a lot of Southern Baptists in leadership that have gone woke. They're pushing Marxism. Okay, so what did Richard Wurmbrand do? He stood up at a meeting that was held for clergy, and stood up and said, "This is unjust." But what did he also know? He told his wife, if you know the story of it, his wife said, "Are you going to stand up and say anything?" And he said, "If I do, you'll never see me again in the side of heaven." And she said, "If you don't, I'll have no respect for you," basically. And so he stood up but he knew the consequences. He understood the consequences and was willing to accept the consequences. He didn't fight the consequences once they came either. Okay. I don't think Bonhoeffer did either. I think Bonhoeffer ended up
killed by it.
Yeah. So
plot to kill Hitler. At least he was.
I mean, I wouldn't agree with plotting to kill Hitler, even though he's.
I know he wrestled with it tremendously. What I read,
Yeah,
how accurate it was. But yeah, I said, wow, to get to that point, just.
Yeah, I mean that becomes a point where you're saying killing Hitler protects millions of lives, and it would have. However, what was God looking to do through it? See, that's the question that has to be asked in it. God raised up Hitler. Now, I would argue God raised up Hitler and allowed Hitler to do what he did so that there would be a nation of Israel today. And there was no nation of Israel for all these years until 1948 because of what Hitler did. Had Hitler not done that, we wouldn't have, I don't think, a nation of Israel right now.
So you could be rising up in the name of righteousness, even though it's ultimately against what God is doing.
Correct. You could rise up in the name of righteousness against what God's ultimately wanting to do. And that's why I think what Peter's saying here is we submit ourselves to the Lord's sake to every human institution. Our eyes have to be focused on the Lord first. He says, whether to a king as the one authority or governor sent by him. So you have two different, like you have the king or those he sends out, but he sends them out, as we saw in Romans 13, sends them out for punishment of evildoers and praise to those who do right. Well, we don't live in a country right now, I think, that praise is right. It punishes right and praises wrong, right? I mean, saying that you don't want to get a vaccine because it's my body, my choice, gets you thrown in jail. But, you're going down to Texas and arguing that, my body, my choice for killing a child. Well, that's a great thing. We live in a strange time. And so, this is the reality is it doesn't matter whether it's the king, the top of in the government system, or those that are sent out. God established all of them. Okay. And so that becomes the issue that we have, is that our submission has to be unto God. We're not submitting to government because they agree with us. We submit to government because they're God's institution on earth. That makes a big difference in how we're going to do it. Now, I know you're going to have questions. So, no, it's not over. I just figured it. Oh, you're still conjuring up your questions, waiting? Okay.
Thinking about.
Okay. So what we end up seeing is our the way we approach this, because what I've been seeing over the last year and a half is a lot of people that are approaching this issue of submission to government from an individual rights perspective. People who are talking about plans to try to not just protect themselves, but hey, we should do something against the government if they come after us. Okay. There's a difference between protection planning and to care for family. And then there's a difference between that and saying we're going to go out and rebel against our government. There's a difference there. Okay. And so I think that, tomorrow night, if you're interested, tomorrow night will be Apologetics Live is going to continue with this theme, because tomorrow night I'll be doing Apologetics Live, and the topic is going to be just war theory and can Christians defend themselves. We're going to do kind of more of a panel discussion type setup. Matt Slick is working on articles on that. He sent me some articles before he put them out to review and get some ideas. So we went back and forth, and he's published at least a couple of those articles now. But we set this up with one of my seminary professors who did his dissertation on just war theory. He knows more about this than like anyone I know. And so it'll be really good to, he's gonna blow your mind with things he's thought of that you're like, oh, I never even thought of that. Like he's really gone through every. I remember in ethics class when we were discussing it, I'm like, I never thought of that. So that'll be something tomorrow night that should be good, and we'll continue with it there. But the main thing that I focus on when I look at our submission to government is really because of the structure that I see here with Peter. See, Paul doesn't argue this way, but Peter does. By the way he's arguing, he's building up, and the goal is, what should our submission to government do? Well, if we look at verses 12 and 15, it tells us what our submission for government should do. See, the reason this style is we're used to something where you have a point leads to the next point, leads to the next point. Okay? That's how we're used to arguing. The reason this style is basically to say this leads to this, but then this leads to this to this. So they go both ways. So yes, our holiness, viewing our holiness is going to lead to having a good testimony. Having a good testimony is going to affect how we submit. But our submission, what is that going to do in verse 15? It should shut the mouth of the ignorant. It should silence, as Peter says, for such is the will of God, that by doing right, you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. That's what submission to government properly would do. It'll silence the ignorance of the unsaved. They have no answer. Why? Because when someone's not fighting back and they know they would fight back, they go, something's different here. What's causing this person not to fight back? What does that lead to? That's going to lead to our holiness again. Right? Not using the same language that Paul uses in Romans 13, but you see it there in verse 16, act as free men, do not use your freedom as a covering for evil. Okay? You end up seeing Paul making the argument in Romans 13, right, where he talks about the darkness and light, okay, about the freedom we have. But now the interesting thing with Romans 13, what's he end it with? He's wraps that whole thing up with, like the night's almost gone, right? He's thinking the end times are right upon him. So we have people today thinking like, look at everything going on. It's like, this has got to be the end times. Paul thought that. He thought this is 2,000 years. This is a long, night. He's like, the night's almost over. It's a long one. I guess that last hour of night took longer than he thought. Right? He had no idea how long this was going to last. Okay. He thought it was almost done. So what does he say? Therefore, lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. That's the same way that Peter's going to end up concluding it. Put aside the fruits of the flesh, right? Put aside the things of darkness. Put aside our pride and submit to God. All right, so any questions thus far? Really? None from you? Wow, you usually have your two minimum. Okay. Well, we could do that after. Okay, so let me close with this. I'll close exactly the way that Peter closes this passage. Verse 17. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. That's kind of the way he's wrapping this up, right? We honor all people. We love the brothers above all people. We fear God, and that fear of God is going to cause us to honor the king. Honor the king? Well, what if the king's not doing righteous? I mean, the king in their day, the emperor, wasn't doing righteous with the Christians. That's right. And so the fact that, our government's not doing righteousness, toward Christians, we still honor them. Okay. So, I knew it'd be a little bit shorter. I actually thought someone would have a lot more questions. So I saved time for that, but,
a good teacher answers the questions.
well, this isn't a sermon. This is a teaching time. So next week we'll take a look at verses 18, probably 18 to 20. We'll see if we can get down to 23, but we'll look to get down at least to 20. I'll be hopeful. Why are you snickering again? You always snicker when I say that. I don't get it. All right. Let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're grateful that we can submit to you. We are grateful that in times when we have lots of questions, especially with what we see in our day and age and our culture, we are lots of questions and just not knowing what to do. So I'm so grateful that your word gives us guidance and direction so that we could know that our submission to government is not for government's sake. It's that we submit to you. It is unto you that we owe all. And so if you call us to difficulty in life, it is short-lived. In one sense, the night is so closely coming to an end, in the sense that as we grow older and older, we come closer and closer to being with you. Even if you have another 2,000 years that you want the earth to continue before you come, our day of visitation is coming close. And Lord, just as in this passage, we need to be mindful that the Gentile world, the unbelieving world is watching us. We need to silence the mouths of ignorant men. We need to do so by the way that we conduct ourselves. So help us to conduct ourselves in a way that we submit to you above all things, so that they have nothing they could say against us. We thank you for it in Christ's name. Amen.